If you ever want to know how quickly a kingdom can make its own enemy, watch what it does when it humiliates the wrong woman. The moon hangs full and cold above the stone circle. Hundreds of wolves have gathered to watch one of their own be broken. She stands at the center, alone, hands trembling, chin lifted anyway. No one will speak for her. No one ever has. A hand rises before the whole pack and falls. The sound cracks across the square like a branch in deep winter. She does not fall. She does not weep. She simply turns and asks the one question no one is willing to answer. And far beyond the mountains, in the dark, something ancient stirs. Something that has waited 1,000 years. Something that just heard her voice and opened its eyes. The wind changes, and the night holds its breath. The moon hung full and white above the gathering ground, pressing its cold light into the black sky like a coin set into velvet. Below it, hundreds of wolves had come. They filled every stone seat around the old circle. Alphas stood tall beside their families. Betas leaned close and traded whispers. Even the children sat still on the outer steps, sensing that something was about to break open in the night. And at the center of all of it stood Sienna Locke. Her hands trembled at her sides. She pressed them flat against her thighs so no one would see. She had learned that trick a long time ago. She had learned a great many things over 24 years of being looked at like a mistake the goddess had forgotten to erase. Tonight was supposed to be no different. That was what she told herself anyway. The wind moved through the banners overhead, and the scent of pine and cold earth drifted across the circle. Beneath it, she caught something else. Fear. Her own. It clung to her skin like frost. She lifted her chin anyway. High above the assembly, on the raised platform, sat the Alpha King, Dorian Cade. He watched the crowd the way a man watches weather he cannot stop. His face gave away nothing. His shoulders were still. Yet there was a tightness at the edge of his jaw. A flicker of something he would not have named even to himself. He did not want to be here. That truth sat low and uncomfortable in his chest, and he buried it the way he buried everything that did not serve the pack. An elder stepped forward and raised a carved staff. The murmuring died at once. "Sienna Locke," the elder said, "you stand accused of dishonoring the sacred trials." A ripple of disapproval rolled through the crowd. Sienna looked out at all those faces. Faces she had grown up beside. Faces she had once hoped, foolishly, might someday soften toward her. They had already decided. She could smell it on them. The eagerness. The quiet hunger of people who had finally found someone they were allowed to blame. "I broke no tradition," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady. It carried farther than she expected. Someone scoffed. Someone else rolled their eyes. A low laugh moved through the younger wolves near the front, and she felt the heat rise into her cheeks. She did not look down. That seemed to bother them more than anything else. Up on the platform, Dorian rose to his feet. The movement alone pulled every eye toward him. That was the thing about him. He never had to raise his voice. The whole world simply turned the way iron turns toward a lodestone. "The trials are not a game," he said. His voice rolled across the square, smooth and certain. Sienna met his gaze, and for one strange, suspended moment, neither of them looked away. She remembered distantly that she had once admired him. She had once believed that somewhere beneath that crown lived a sense of fairness. She had believed it the way a child believes in things that have never once been proven. Tonight, she was no longer sure. "Then why?" she asked softly. "Am I the only one standing here?" The question landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. A few wolves shifted. A few frowned. The elder glanced toward the platform, uncertain. Dorian felt the question reach somewhere it had no business reaching. He did not let it show. What he let them see was the answer they wanted. Because your actions drew attention to yourself. Laughter broke loose among the young ones again, sharper this time, and Sienna felt it land on her skin like small stones. Still she stood. The moonlight caught her hair and turned it the color of pale silver. The wind lifted it gently from her shoulders, and though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, she would not give them the one thing they had come for. She would not break. That was the moment Dorian stepped down from the platform. The crowd hushed. He crossed the stone in slow, even strides, and with every step closer, the air around Sienna seemed to change. There was a scent to him, cedar and rain and something darker underneath, something that made the back of her neck prickle in a way she did not understand and did not welcome. He stopped an arm's length away. She held his eyes, and then, before the whole pack, beneath the full and watching moon, he struck her. The sound of it cracked across the square like a branch snapping in deep winter. Her face turned with the blow. Her hair fell across her cheek. Somewhere in the crowd a child gasped, and somewhere else a wolf made a low sound of approval, and both of those sounds would stay with her for a very long time. Sienna did not fall. She did not lift a hand to her face. She slowly turned back toward him, and she looked at him as though she were memorizing exactly who he was. Dorian's own hand still hung in the air between them. For one heartbeat, one single traitorous heartbeat, something in his chest recoiled from what he had just done. The scent of her had shifted. Pain, yes, but not fear. Never fear. And beneath the pain there was something he could not name, something that pulled at the oldest part of him like a tide, answering a moon he could not see. He lowered his hand. He told himself it was nothing. He was very good at telling himself things. "You will leave this circle," he said, and his voice did not shake. "And you will not stand among us again." The square erupted. Some wolves nodded. Some looked relieved. A few looked almost glad. The way people look when a thing they have always disliked is finally pushed out of sight. And Sienna felt something inside her go very still. Not from the slap. Not from the shame. From understanding. No one was coming to defend her. No one was going to step forward. No one was going to turn to the crowd and tell them they were wrong. She had always known it, somewhere deep down. But knowing a thing and feeling it are not the same. And tonight, she felt it all the way to the bone. It should have shattered her. Instead, something strange and quiet settled over her heart. A calm she had never felt before, as though some part of her had simply stopped waiting for a rescue that was never going to come. And in that exact moment, the wind changed. The torches around the square guttered and leaned sideways. The banners snapped. Several wolves looked up, frowning, as a cold current swept down from the mountains in the north. Then it came. A howl. It rolled across the night from somewhere far beyond the territory, beyond any border drawn on any map. It was deep, ancient, heavy enough to stop conversation in the middle of a breath. Every wolf in the square went still. Sienna heard it, but more than that, she felt it, not with her ears, with her soul. It moved through her chest and curled around her heart like a voice speaking a name she had forgotten she owned. For one impossible moment, beneath that watching moon, she could have sworn that something vast and old and patient had just opened its eyes. And somewhere on the platform behind her, Dorian Cade turned his face toward the mountains, and for the first time that night, the Alpha King felt the cold finger of something he could not command. The howl faded. The silence it left behind was deeper than any silence the square had ever known. Sienna pulled her cloak tight around her shoulders. She did not look back at the crowd. She did not look back at him. She turned toward the dark line of the mountains. And somewhere inside her chest, that strange warmth had already begun to glow. The stone streets of the village stretched out before her, washed pale by the moon. Sienna walked alone. Her footsteps were the only sound. The shops had closed their shutters. The lanterns had been pulled inside. And every window she passed seemed to watch her go, the way the crowd had watched, with that same quiet satisfaction. She did not cry. She had used up all her tears years ago, on people who did not deserve a single one of them. The cold air carried the scent of wood smoke and frost, and somewhere beneath it, faint and fading, the cedar and rain that belonged to him. She walked faster. The cottage she rented sat near the northern edge of the village, small and plain, with a single window and a roof that complained in the wind. The walk usually took her the length of a quiet song. Tonight, it felt like crossing an ocean. Halfway there, she heard the footsteps behind her. She did not need to turn around to know whose they were. Her body knew before her mind did. The back of her neck warmed. The air seemed to thicken. That scent reached her again, stronger now, and something deep inside her stirred and strained toward it, like a plant turning toward light. She hated that. She hated it more than the slap. She stopped walking. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Dorian stood a few paces back, where the shadow of a wall fell across the road. He had not meant to follow her. That was the part he kept turning over in his mind, the way a man turns a stone he has found in his boot. He had not meant to come. His feet had simply carried him out of the square and down the empty streets, after a woman he had just cast out in front of his entire pack. There was no sense in it. There was no sense in any of what he was feeling. And Dorian Cade was a man who lived and ruled by sense. Yet here he stood. "You should not have followed me," Sienna said. She did not turn around. He exhaled slowly. "I did not come here to argue." A small, tired sound escaped her, not quite a laugh. That would be a first. His jaw tightened. For a moment he looked less like a king and more like a man carrying something heavy, something he could not set down and could not explain. The pack needed stability, he said. And finally she turned. The moonlight caught the side of her face, the cheek that still carried the faint red echo of his hand. She did not flinch from his gaze. She held it, steady and clear, and when she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "No," she said. The pack needed someone to blame. The words landed harder than either of them expected. Dorian said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because she was right, and they both knew it, and the knowing sat between them in the cold like a third person neither of them had invited. He had told himself a story tonight, a story about order, about tradition, about the difficult things a leader must do. It had sounded reasonable inside his own head. It had sounded almost noble. Standing here now, in the dark, with the scent of her wrapped around him and her pale eyes refusing to look away, the story fell apart in his hands. "You think me cruel," he said. It was not a question. "I think," Sienna said slowly, "that you are a man who has never once had to stand where I stood tonight." The silence stretched. She studied him then, really studied him, the hard line of his shoulders, the careful stillness he wore like armor. And somewhere underneath all of that, she saw it. A flicker, a crack, something almost like regret moving behind his eyes before he locked it away. It did not soften her. If anything, it made her angrier. Because regret was easy. Regret cost nothing. Regret did not undo a hand raised before hundreds of watching faces. "You felt it too," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. Dorian went very still. He knew exactly what she meant. He had felt it the moment he stepped close to her in the square. That pull, that ancient wordless tug somewhere beneath the ribs, as though some part of him had recognized some part of her long before either of them was born. A mate bond did not announce itself with gentleness. It arrived like a tide, and it had no respect at all for crowns or pride or the careful walls a man spent his whole life building. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said. It was a lie. They both heard it. Sienna let out a slow breath, and the cold turned it to silver mist in the air between them. "Of course you do not," she said softly. She turned and began walking again. This time, he did not follow. He stood in the empty street and watched her go, watched the moonlight slide along her silver hair, and the strangest, most unwelcome thought rose in him as she disappeared into the dark. He had given an order tonight that would erase her from the life of the pack, and every part of him that he did not control wanted desperately to call her back. He did not. He was very good at not doing things. When Sienna finally reached the cottage, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, eyes closed until her heartbeat slowed. The little room was just as she had left it. A bed, a cold hearth, a wooden table scarred by years of use. It had never been much, but it had always been hers, and it had always been safe. Tonight, even that felt thin. She lit a small fire and sat beside the window, pulling a worn blanket around her shoulders. Outside, the moon climbed higher. The village slept, and the red mark on her cheek throbbed in time with her pulse, a small, steady reminder of everything she had lost in a single evening. She had spent so many years trying to earn a place here, trying to be useful enough, quiet enough, good enough, that one day they might look at her and see something other than a mistake. Tonight she finally understood the truth. There had never been anything she could have done. The verdict had been written long before she was born, and no amount of good behavior was ever going to change the minds of people who had already decided what she was. That should have broken her. Strangely, it set her free. Sleep did not come. The fire burned low, then lower, casting long shadows across the floorboards. And somewhere in the deep hours, When the village was at its most silent, the strange feeling from the square returned. It began as warmth beneath her ribs, not painful, not frightening. Simply there, a glow, soft and steady, like an ember that refused to go out. Sienna pressed a hand to her chest. The warmth grew stronger, and then she heard it. A voice, faint at first, so faint she was certain she had imagined it. She held her breath and went perfectly still, and the small room seemed to lean in around her. The voice came again, deeper this time, older. It did not come from the door, or the window, or any corner of the room. It seemed to rise from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the very moonlight spilling across the boards. Fear should have taken hold of her. Instead, curiosity pulled her up out of the chair and toward the door. She stepped outside into the cold. The night air wrapped around her, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of snow that had not yet fallen. The village lay quiet and dark. Above it all, the full moon poured silver light across the valley, turning the rooftops to pale stone and the distant fields to sheets of ice. And then she saw it. Far to the north, near the dark ridge of the mountains, a single pale glow flickered between the peaks. One flash, then another, as though something hidden deep in the wilderness was lifting a lantern, and lowering it, and lifting it again. A signal, a heartbeat of light, meant only for her. The warmth in her chest surged, and the voice returned, clearer than before. 2 words, soft as breath against her ear. Find me. Sienna stood frozen beneath the stars. The mountains were a long way off. Dozens of miles of forest and ruin and old forgotten things stood between her and that flickering light. No one with any sense would make that journey alone. And yet, the moment the voice faded, she knew one thing with a certainty that frightened her. Whatever had woken tonight was real. And somehow, impossibly, it knew her name. Across the village, in the high stone hall of the pack, Dorian Cade could not sleep either. He stood at a tall window, looking out at the same moon, and he could not shake the feeling that had followed him home from the square. His advisor found him there. Mercer moved like a man who had spent a lifetime in quiet rooms, soft of step and softer of voice, and he carried a cup of something warm that the king did not take. A difficult night, Mercer said. It was necessary, Dorian answered. The words felt like stones in his mouth. Mercer studied him for a moment, those pale, careful eyes missing nothing. The pack will sleep easier now, the older wolf said. These things are unpleasant, but order must be kept. A king who does not enforce the trials is no king at all. Dorian said nothing. He was thinking of a pale face that had refused to fall, of a question he still had no honest answer for. Why am I the only one standing here? You did well, Mercer said gently, and something in the way he said it, something just slightly too smooth, made the smallest thread of unease move through Dorian's chest. He did not know yet why the girl mattered. He only knew that she did, in a way that had nothing to do with the trials, and everything to do with that ancient howl rolling down from the mountains. That sound tonight, Dorian said, from the north. You heard it. Mercer's expression did not change, but his pause was a half-breath too long. Thunder, the advisor said. Nothing more. It was the second lie Dorian had heard that night. He recognized this one too. He let it pass. He did not yet have the shape of the thing taking form in the dark. But Dorian Cade had not become king by ignoring the small cold prickles at the back of his neck, and one was climbing his spine now. "Leave me," he said quietly. Mercer bowed and withdrew, and the soft sound of his steps faded down the hall. Alone again, the king looked north. Somewhere out there, beneath the same moon, a woman he had cast out was looking at the very same mountains. He could not have known it. And yet, some buried, instinctive part of him turned toward her as surely as a needle turns toward true north, and would not be still. Before dawn, Sienna made her choice. She did not agonize over it. She did not weigh the danger or count the miles. She simply packed what little she could carry into a weathered canvas satchel, a knife, a flint, a half loaf of bread, the blanket from her bed. She paused once at the door and looked back at the small room that had held so many of her quiet years. There was no one to say goodbye to. That was its own kind of answer. The truth she had felt in the square had hardened overnight into something sharper. If she vanished tonight, no one in this village would lose a single thing. No one would search for her. No one would even slow their step. To them, she was nothing. A name to be struck from a list. But the voice in the mountains had called her by that name, as though it were precious. As though it were a thing worth crossing the whole wild north to reach. And so Sienna stepped out into the gray hush before dawn and turned her back on the only home she had ever known. The road north lay empty and pale before her. The warmth in her chest pulsed once, steady and sure, like a compass finding its bearing. She did not look back at the village. She had spent enough of her life looking back. Whatever waited in those mountains, whatever had opened its eyes beneath the full moon and spoken her name into the dark, she was going to find it. And somewhere far behind her, in a cold stone hall, a king stood at a window and felt, without understanding why, that something had just slipped out of his hands forever. The deeper she traveled, the quieter the world became. By the time the sun climbed high, Sienna had left the marked trails far behind her. The villages thinned. The roads turned to footpaths. And the footpaths turned to nothing at all, just earth and root and the slow climb of the land toward the mountains. She walked through the morning and into the afternoon. And as she walked, the forest changed around her. At first there was birdsong, bright and ordinary, the small chatter of a living wood, but mile by mile it faded until the only sound was the wind moving through the high pines, and even that seemed to whisper rather than blow. The trees grew older here, taller. Their trunks were wide as towers, their bark dark and deeply grooved, and moss hung from their branches in long gray curtains. The light came down green and dim, broken into soft pieces by the canopy far above. Sienna had heard the old stories as a child. Everyone had. The wilderness to the north was a place of warnings. Some said ancient spirits slept beneath its roots. Some said forgotten kings had hidden their treasures there and never come back to claim them. Most people laughed at such tales by daylight and locked their doors against them by night. Standing among these towering trees now, she was no longer sure which side of that laughter she belonged on. The warmth in her chest had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger with every mile, a steady glow pulling her forward like a hand pressed gently against her back. The voice had not spoken again since the night she left. It did not need to. She knew, in a way she could not have explained to anyone, that she was walking in the right direction. As the afternoon light began to slant and gold, she came to a narrow valley carved between two ridges. She stopped at its edge. Great stones rose from the earth on either side, weathered and enormous, like the ribs of some vast creature that had lain down here long ago and let the forest grow over its bones. Vines spilled from the cracks. Moss softened every hard edge. And there, half buried beneath roots and earth at the far end of the valley, stood an archway. Sienna's breath caught. It was a circle of pale stone, taller than two men, carved with symbols that twisted across its surface in spirals and crescents. Centuries of rain and snow had worn at it, yet the carvings remained, faint but unmistakable. She crossed the valley slowly. Her heart was beating very hard. The closer she came, the louder the warmth in her chest seemed to hum, until it was almost a sound, almost a song, just beneath her hearing. She reached the archway and stood before it, and her fingers rose, almost on their own, to brush the cold, pale stone. The moment she touched it, a memory surfaced. Not a true memory. Something older than memory. A feeling, vast and sudden, that rose up through her hand and into her chest. Moonlight spilling across silver banners. Voices speaking a language she did not know and somehow almost understood. A crown of pale crystal resting on dark velvet. The sensation vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving her breathless and trembling, her hands still pressed to the stone. Sienna stepped back. Her eyes lifted to the top of the arch, where one symbol stood larger than all the rest. A crescent moon, wrapped around the shape of a wolf. Her stomach dropped. She knew that mark, not from any book, not from any story. She knew it from her own skin, from the birthmark she had carried beneath her left shoulder since the day she was born. A strange shape that the healers had always frowned at and called meaningless. A flaw. One more small reason for people to look at her sideways. Slowly, she reached beneath her cloak and pressed her fingers to the spot through the fabric. The shape matched. Exactly. "That is not possible," she whispered. The forest held its silence. And then the voice returned, clearer and warmer than it had ever been, filling the whole valley at once. "You have finally arrived." Sienna spun around. No one stood behind her. The valley was empty, the long shadows of evening stretching across the grass. Yet the words echoed in the stone and in her bones, ancient and patient and somehow kind. Beneath her fingertips, the archway began to glow. Silver light flowed through the carved symbols like water finding the beds of forgotten rivers. The ground trembled softly beneath her boots, not enough to frighten her, only enough to remind her that something very old was waking. Far above, the clouds drifted clear of the rising moon. Pale light poured down into the valley, and the earth beneath the archway began to shift. Roots drew slowly back. Stone slid against stone, and out of the hillside, step by step, a hidden staircase emerged, descending down into darkness beneath the mountain. Sienna stared at it. Every sensible thought in her head told her to turn around, to go back to the thin safety of the world she knew. But she had spent her whole life listening to sensible thoughts, listening to the voices that told her to be small, to be quiet, to be grateful for the little she was given. She was done listening to them. She stepped through the archway and began to descend. The staircase seemed to go on forever. Moonlight followed her down somehow, glowing faintly from the walls themselves, lighting smooth stone carved with countless images, wolves standing beside crowned figures, silver banners flowing above great cities, vast halls built beneath glowing moons. None of it matched the history she had been taught. Every lesson of her childhood had said the same thing. The Alpha lines had ruled the North for as long as anyone could remember. There was nothing before them. There had never been anything before them. But these carvings told another story, a far older one. The deeper she went, the more certain she became that someone had worked very hard, for a very long time, to make sure that story was never told. At last, the stairs opened into a vast chamber. Sienna stopped breathing. The room stretched out farther than her eyes could follow. Crystal formations covered the ceiling, glittering with soft silver light that fell across the cavern like moonlight through water. At the center stood a circle of 12 tall stone pillars, and on every pillar, the same crescent wolf, the same mark she carried on her skin. The warmth in her chest blazed. Her feet were moving before she chose to move them. One step, then another. As she crossed the chamber, the crystals overhead grew brighter, and a low hum rose from somewhere deep within the walls, ancient mechanisms stirring after a long, long sleep. Then she saw it. At the center of the chamber, on a raised platform of pale stone, lay an enormous wolf. It was carved, or it seemed carved, from luminous stone, and it stood as tall as 3 men. Its great head rested on its paws. Its eyes were closed, and yet, even motionless, even silent, it felt more alive than anything Sienna had ever stood near. Her throat tightened. She knew, without being told, that this was the source of the voice. The last few steps were the hardest. Not because anything stood in her way, because standing so near to it filled her with a feeling she had no name for. The kind of awe a person feels standing at the edge of a great storm, or beneath mountains so high they seem to hold up the sky. "Who are you?" she whispered. For several long seconds, there was only silence. Then the great wolf answered, "I am what remains." Its crystal eyes opened. Silver light flooded the chamber, and Sienna staggered back a step, her heart slamming against her ribs. Yet she felt no danger, only a deep, impossible sense of recognition, as though she had finally come home to a place she had never been. The moon wolf studied her with ancient patience. "For a very long time," it said, "this place has waited." "Waited for what?" Sienna breathed. The great head lifted. "For the last of the line." The words moved through her like cold water. "The last of what line?" she asked. "I am no one. I am an Omega. I was cast out tonight in front of my whole pack. I have nothing. I am nothing. You are the last daughter of the moon sovereigns." The chamber fell utterly silent. Sienna shook her head slowly. The word felt absurd in her mouth. Impossible. Ridiculous. And yet, every instinct she had told her the creature spoke the truth. Images flooded her mind, fast and bright and overwhelming. Cities beneath moonlit skies, crowns forged of silver crystal, thousands of wolves gathered before a throne older than any kingdom now living. And then, last of all, a woman standing beneath a full moon. her eyes the same pale silver as Sienna's own. The vision vanished. Tears were running down Sienna's face before she understood why she was crying. Long ago, the Moon Wolf said gently, the sovereigns ruled the north, not with fear, not with force, but with the simple law that no life was worth more than another, that a wolf was measured by the truth of the heart, never by the rank of the blood. It paused. Those who came after wanted a different kind of power, so they buried the old ways. They erased the names. They taught their children that the sovereigns had never been, and they hunted those who remembered. Then how am I here? Sienna whispered. Because your family did the bravest thing of all, the wolf said. They gave up everything, their titles, their wealth, their power. They hid among ordinary packs and lived as the lowest of the low, so that one daughter, generations later, might still carry the mark and the blood. Sienna pressed a hand to her shoulder, over the birthmark she had been taught to be ashamed of. The mark that had made her strange. The mark that had made her less. The mark that had, it turned out, been the most precious thing she would ever carry. They hid me so well, she said, her voice breaking, that even I did not know. The kingdoms forget, the Moon Wolf said softly, but the throne remembers. The blood remembers. It lowered its great luminous head until its silver eyes were level with hers. And now, daughter, the Moon Wolf has awakened. Far away in the cold stone heart of the Packlands, Dorian Cade was not sleeping. He stood alone in a long forgotten room, surrounded by shelves that had not been touched in generations. Dust lay thick on everything. Old maps were spread across a heavy table, their edges curling, their ink faded to the color of weak tea. He did not fully understand what had brought him here, only that the howl from the north had not left him, only that the question the cast-out woman had asked him still circled his mind like a wolf that would not lie down. Why am I the only one standing here? An old keeper of records had brought him a weathered volume, bound in cracked leather, its pages sealed for longer than anyone could say. Most believed it only a story, she had told him. Dorian had opened it anyway, and what he found there had made him sit down very slowly. Drawings, a crescent moon wrapped around a wolf, silver towers, pathways carved beneath the mountains, and words, written in an old and careful hand, describing the moon sovereigns, the first rulers of the north, the rulers who had come before the alphas, the rulers whose very existence had been scrubbed from every lesson he had ever been taught. He turned the page, then another, and there, near the end, one line stopped his breath entirely. The last heir shall bear silver eyes and the mark of the crescent wolf. Dorian sat very still. Silver eyes. He had looked into a pair of silver eyes only the night before, eyes that had refused to fall even as his hand struck her face, eyes that had asked him a question he still could not answer. A cold understanding began to spread through his chest. He thought of the way the air had changed when he stepped close to her, the pull, the ancient wordless tug beneath his ribs that he had lied about, to her and to himself. A mate bond did not choose by rank, it chose by truth. And it had chosen, against all sense, against all the careful order of his life, the woman he had cast out into the dark. The records keeper had gone. Dorian was alone with the book and the dust and the slow, terrible weight of a mistake he could not undo. He did not hear Mercer enter. The advisor moved like smoke, and he was standing at the edge of the lamplight before Dorian sensed him at all. "You are awake very late, my king," Mercer said. Dorian closed the book, not quickly, but not slowly either. "I could not sleep." Mercer's pale eyes moved to the cracked leather cover and lingered there a moment too long before lifting again. "Old stories," the advisor said, with a thin and patient smile. "Dangerous things sometimes. They have a way of unsettling the order of the present." "You know this book," Dorian said. It was not a question. Mercer spread his hands, all gentleness and ease. "I know many books. It is my duty to know them, so that my king need not trouble himself with fables." "Fables?" Dorian repeated. "Of course." Mercer's smile did not waver. "There were never any sovereigns. There was never any older throne. There is only the order we keep, and the order we keep is the only thing that stands between the pack and ruin." He said it smoothly, reasonably, and for the first time in many years, Dorian Cade did not believe a single word his advisor said. He thought of the howl from the north. He thought of silver eyes. He thought of how very quickly Mercer had appeared at his shoulder, both tonight and the night before, as though the old wolf were watching for exactly this. "Leave the book with me," Dorian said. Something flickered behind Mercer's eyes, just for an instant. Then it was gone, smoothed over like a footprint in fresh snow. "As you wish, my king," Mercer murmured and bowed and withdrew. But as the soft sound of his steps faded down the hall, Dorian sat alone in the lamplight and understood that he had just made an enemy of the most patient man he knew. Beneath the mountain, the chamber had grown quiet again. The wonder of the revelation had begun to settle, and in its place came a colder thing. Because Sienna was not alone anymore. In the hours since she had descended, others had come, not many. A handful of figures who had felt the same pull she had, who had heard the same ancient call rolling down from the peaks, and had followed it into the wild. A gray-haired woman named Maeve. A quiet former hunter called Bram. A young man who barely lifted his eyes from the floor. They gathered near the warmth of a small fire at the chamber's edge, and they looked to Sienna with a hope that frightened her more than the moonwolf had. She did not feel like a queen. She felt like a woman who had been struck across the face the night before. It was the young man who finally broke the fragile quiet. His name was Rowan, and he had arrived later than the others, and he had not been able to meet anyone's eyes the whole evening. Now he stood. "There is something I have to tell you," he said, "before it is too late to say it." Sienna turned to him. Something in his voice made the warmth in her chest go cold. Rowan swallowed hard. His hands were shaking. "When I left the village," he said, "someone paid me. A man close to the capital. He wanted to know about anything strange. Lights in the north, people leaving their packs, talk of old marks and older thrones." The chamber had gone very still. "You are a spy," Bram said quietly. It was not an accusation. It was almost a sorrow. "I was," Rowan said. "I did not know what I would find. I thought it was nothing. I thought I would take his coin and watch an empty forest." He lifted his eyes at last, and they were full of shame. "I did not know it would be real. I did not know it would be this." "Did you tell them?" Sienna asked. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "What you found? This place? Did you tell them?" Rowan shook his head. "Not yet," he whispered. "Not yet." The two words hung in the cold air of the chamber like a blade waiting to fall. Sienna looked from face to face, at Maeve, who had come seeking hope, at Bram, who had come seeking purpose, at Rowan, who had come for coin and found something that had broken his heart open. And she understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, that the world above had already begun to reach for them. The secret was leaking. Somewhere in the capital, a patient man was waiting for word. And when that word came, whether through Rowan or through someone else, the small, fragile thing taking shape beneath this mountain would no longer be a secret at all. It would be a threat. And threats, in the world Sienna had been cast out of, were not forgiven. They were erased. She looked up at the Moonwolf, whose silver eyes watched her with that same ancient patience. "They will come for us," she said softly. "Yes," the great wolf answered, "and we are not ready." "No," it agreed, "you are not." Sienna drew a slow breath and felt the warmth in her chest steady into something harder, something that was not quite courage yet, but was learning how to become it. "Then we had better begin," she said. And far to the north, beyond the ridges, the moon slipped behind a veil of cloud, as though the night itself had drawn a breath, and was waiting to see what she would do. The days that followed did not feel like the building of a kingdom. They felt like the slow, stubborn work of staying alive. More people came, not in great numbers, but in ones and twos, drawn out of the wilderness by a pull they could not explain. A blacksmith and his wife, an old healer with knowing hands, a widow named Cora, who had lost her home and had nothing left to lose by coming, a pair of brothers carrying packs heavy with tools. Each new face brought hope, and each new face brought one more mouth to feed. Sienna learned quickly that wonder did not fill an empty stomach. The glowing crystals could not be eaten. The ancient carvings could not keep the cold out. The miracle beneath the mountain was beautiful, and it was real, and none of it would matter at all if these people starved before the snow even fell. So she worked. She helped carry water and stack wood. She learned the names of every person who came, and the stories they carried, and the small private fears they tried to hide. She sat with the frightened ones late into the night. She did not pretend to have answers she did not have. And slowly, without quite noticing the moment it happened, the others began to look to her. Not because she demanded it, because she stayed. The Moonwolf watched all of it from its platform and said little. But Sienna had begun to notice something that troubled her more than the dwindling food. The great creature was fading. Each day, its luminous form seemed a little less solid. Each day, its voice seemed to travel a little farther before it reached her. The first time she saw the crystal light shine faintly through its shoulder, as though through mist, her heart had clenched in a way she did not understand. "You are giving something away," she said to it one evening, "to wake all of this, to feed us, to hold this place together." The Moonwolf did not deny it. "What remains," it said gently, "remains to be spent." She had no answer for that. She only knew that she did not want to lose it, and that the wanting frightened her, because it had been a very long time since she had let herself want anything at all. Far to the south, in his cold stone hall, Dorian Cade made a decision that astonished everyone who heard it. He would go north himself. The advisors objected, of course. Loudest among them was Mercer, who stood very still when the king announced it, the way a man stands still when the ground has shifted beneath him. If the rumors are true, Mercer said carefully, this is the birth of a rival throne. You do not ride to meet a rival throne. You send strength. You send numbers. You remind them what power looks like. I am not going to remind anyone of anything, Dorian said. Then why go at all? The king looked out the frost-rimmed window toward the dark line of the mountains. Because I need to see it with my own eyes. He took no army. That was the part that unsettled Mercer most, and the part Dorian could least explain. He brought only a handful of trusted riders, and he left the banners of war behind. Something in him refused to ride toward those silver eyes at the head of a column of soldiers. Something in him knew that he had already done enough damage with a single hand. The riding was hard. The farther north they went, the quieter the land became, just as the old book had described. The birdsong faded. The trees grew ancient. And with every mile, the pull beneath Dorian's ribs grew stronger, that wordless tug he had lied about, until it was less a feeling and more a direction, a compass needle buried in his own chest. He did not tell his riders about it. There were no words for it that would not have made him sound like a man losing his mind. By the time they reached the high valley, the first thin snow had begun to fall, and what Dorian found there stopped him cold. He had expected fortifications, a rival army, the hard glitter of ambition. Instead, he found a place that was alive. Homes built into the old stone, gardens covered against the coming frost, smoke rising from cook fires, children running between the pillars, laughing, their breath bright in the cold air. He saw a blacksmith mending a tool for a man who could not pay him, and waving away the offered coin. He saw the old healer pressing something warm into the hands of a shivering widow. He saw people helping people with no thought of rank at all. Nothing here matched the threat that the capital whispered about. And standing at the heart of it, her silver hair catching the pale winter light, was the woman he had cast out. Sienna saw the riders before they reached the gate. The whole valley went quiet. She felt the old fear rise up in her, the body remembering the square, the crowd, the crack of his hand across her face. Her people gathered close behind her, and she felt their fear too, layered over her own. But this time, she was not standing alone. That single fact changed everything. Dorian dismounted at the edge of the settlement and crossed the last distance on foot. He left his riders behind him. He came to her the way a man comes to something he is not sure he has the right to approach. He stopped a few paces away, and the scent of him reached her, cedar and rain and that dark warmth beneath, the scent that had haunted the back of her neck since the night he struck her. It hit her harder than she expected, and she hated the way her body answered it, the way the warmth in her chest leaned toward him even now, even after everything. The bond did not care what he had done. The bond only knew its own. You came with no army, she said. No. Why? Dorian was quiet for a long moment. The snow fell softly between them. Because I came to see the truth, he said. And a man surrounded by soldiers only ever sees what soldiers let him see. She studied him, the hard line of his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes that had not been there before. Whatever he had ridden north carrying, it had cost him sleep. And what truth did you find? She asked. His gaze moved past her, across the gardens and the cook fires and the laughing children, across all of it. When he looked back at her, something in his face had broken open. "More than I wanted to," he said. They walked. It was not planned. They simply began to move, away from the watching crowd, along the edge of the valley where the old stones rose up out of the snow. Her people let them go. The moon wolf watched from its platform and said nothing. For a while, neither of them spoke. The snow muffled the world. Their footsteps left dark prints behind them, and the pull between them filled the silence so completely that words seemed almost unnecessary. "I read of your line," Dorian said at last. "In a book they tried to bury the sovereigns, the ones who came before. Then you know what I am. I know what they wrote." He paused. "I am still learning what you are." Sienna stopped walking. She turned to face him, and the cold wind lifted her hair, and her silver eyes were bright and hard. "What I am," she said, "is the woman you struck in front of your entire pack. The woman not one of you would defend. You looked at me that night, and you saw something worthless, something easy to throw away." Dorian flinched. It was small. He hid it almost at once, but she saw it. "I cannot undo that night," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "You cannot." The snow fell between them, and then he took a step closer, and the bond surged, and the air seemed to grow warm despite the cold. She should have moved back. She did not. He lifted his hand slowly, the same hand that had struck her, and for a moment it simply hung in the air between them, trembling almost. Then his fingers brushed the line of her jaw, light as breath, where the mark of that hand had once burned. The touch went through her like lightning. Every nerve in her body lit at once. The warmth in her chest flared into something fierce and aching, and she heard his breath catch, felt the answering tremor run through him, and knew that he felt it too. This pull, this impossible, unwanted, undeniable thing between them. "I have felt it since that night," he said. His voice had dropped low and rough. "I told you I did not know what you meant. That was a lie. I have felt it every hour since you walked away from me." His thumb moved gently along her cheek. Sienna closed her eyes. For one long, dangerous moment, she let herself feel it. The heat of his hand, the nearness of him, the pull that had no respect at all for pride or pain or everything that stood between them. It would have been so easy to lean into it, so easy to let the bond decide, to fall into the warmth of being chosen at last. So easy. And that was exactly why she opened her eyes and stepped back. The cold rushed into the space where he had been. Dorian's hand fell. "No," Sienna said. The word was quiet. It was also absolute. "No," she said again. "You do not get to do this now. Sienna, you do not get to choose me now." Her voice shook, but she did not look away from him. "Not after the square. Not after the crowd. You did not want me when I was nothing. You did not see me when I had nothing. You raised your hand to me in front of everyone, and not one part of you hesitated." "That is not true." His voice was raw. "Part of me hesitated. Part of me has not stopped hesitating since." "Part of you," she repeated softly. "And what good is part of a man when a woman is standing alone before the whole world?" He had no answer. She could see it land in him, the truth of it, heavy and undeniable. "The bond chose me when it was convenient," she said. "When you found a book. When you learned I might be a queen instead of a castaway, you did not come north for the woman you struck. You came north for the daughter of a throne. That is not why I came. Then why? Because I could not stay away. The words burst out of him, and they were not the words of a king. They were the words of a man who had run out of careful things to say. Because every road south felt wrong. Because something in me has been turned toward you since the moment you asked me why you were standing there alone. And I have not had a single peaceful hour since. The snow fell. Sienna's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. She wanted to believe him. That was the worst part. The bond wanted to believe him. And the lonely girl she had been for 24 years wanted to believe him most of all. But she had spent her whole life being grateful for scraps. She would not do it again. Not even for this. I believe that you feel it, she said. I feel it too. I will not pretend that I do not. She drew a breath, but feeling is not the same as worth. You can ache for me with every bone in your body, Dorian Cade, and it will not be enough. Because I will not be chosen out of pity. I will not be chosen out of guilt. And I will not be chosen because a bond decided it for you. Her voice steadied. If you ever choose me, she said, you will choose me with your eyes open. You will choose me knowing exactly what I am and exactly what I am not. And you will choose me as an equal, not as a sin you are trying to make right. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw it. Not anger, not wounded pride. Something far more dangerous to her resolve. Respect. Then I will earn it, he said quietly. She had not expected that. What? You heard me. He glanced back toward the settlement, at the cook fires and the gardens and the people who had followed her into the wild. You said, I never wanted you when you were nothing. So I will stay. Not as a king. Not with riders at my back. I will stay here, in this valley, and I will work beside the people who chose you. And when winter is over, you can look at me again and decide what you see. Sienna stared at him. You are the Alpha King. I was an Alpha King who struck a woman for standing too straight, he said. I am not sure that is a thing worth being. She did not have words. For the first time since that night in the square, the careful armored man she had known was gone, and in his place stood someone she did not recognize. Someone uncertain. Someone willing. It would have been easier if he had argued, if he had commanded, if he had given her one more reason to close the door. He had not. He had simply offered to begin again on her terms, in the cold, with nothing. And that frightened her more than the bond ever had. That night, Sienna climbed to the great chamber alone. The moon wolf was waiting, as it always was, its faded silver eyes catching the crystal light. You sent him away, it said. I sent away the easy thing, she answered. I am not sure that is the same. The great creature regarded her for a long while. You felt the bond, it said, and you refused it. I refused to be chosen for the wrong reasons. She wrapped her arms around herself. Was that wrong? Tell me. You are the one who knows the old ways. Was I a fool to step back? The moon wolf rose slowly to its great translucent feet. There is something you must understand, it said. This place, this throne, all of it. does not wake by my power alone. It wakes by the truth of the one who carries the blood. When you doubt yourself, the light dims. When you betray yourself, the light fails." It lowered its head toward her. "Had you fallen into his arms tonight to escape your own loneliness, you would have given a piece of yourself away, and this kingdom would have felt it. It wakes only as fully as you are whole." Sienna let out a slow, shaking breath. "So I was right. You were true," the moon wolf corrected gently, "which is harder and rarer and worth far more." She looked toward the chamber entrance, toward the cold valley above where a king was learning, for the first time in his life, how to be ordinary. "And if he truly earns it?" she asked quietly. "If he chooses me with his eyes open, as an equal, what then?" The moon wolf's faded eyes seemed almost to smile. "Then the bond will not be a chain," it said. "It will be a crown that two heads may wear without either bowing." Sienna stood in the silver light for a long time after that. Below, in the valley, Dorian Cade slept beneath a borrowed roof, on a bed no softer than any common wolf's, having handed his fine cloak to a shivering child without a second thought. He did not sleep easily. The pull was still there, aching, insistent, turned north toward the chamber where she stood. But beneath the ache, for the first time in a very long while, there was something steadier, a purpose that had nothing to do with a crown. He had come north expecting to find a threat to his power. He had found instead the first thing in his life that had ever made him want to be a better man. And as the snow fell soft and endless over the sleeping valley, neither of them yet knew that the world they had left behind was already sharpening its knives, and that the patient man in the capital had just received the word he had been waiting for. Winter came early, and it came hard. The first true storm swept down out of the peaks without warning, and by morning the valley lay buried under a thick white silence. The gardens vanished beneath it. The pathways disappeared. The cold reached into the old stone halls and curled there like something alive. Bram returned from the hunt with empty hands. He did not have to say anything. The look on his face said it for him. Game was scarce. The deep snow had driven the animals down and away, and what little remained was too thin and too clever to catch. Maeve counted the stores that evening by the light of a single lantern. When she finished, she was quiet for a long time. "At this rate," she said at last, "perhaps 3 weeks. If we are careful, if no one else comes." 3 weeks. The words moved through the gathered people like a cold draft. Sienna felt them land. She felt the fear rise up in the room, the old familiar fear of bodies that had known hunger before, and remembered exactly how it felt. The miracle beneath the mountain had never seemed smaller. The glowing crystals, the ancient carvings, the throne older than any kingdom. None of it could be eaten. None of it could keep a child warm through a winter that had arrived weeks too soon. It was Soren who finally said the thing that everyone was thinking. He was one of the younger ones, quick-tempered and quick to fear, and he stood near the fire with his hands clenched. "We followed a voice," he said. "We followed a voice into the mountains because we wanted something better. But wanting a thing does not make it real. And it does not fill a stomach." No one interrupted him. "We are running out of food," Soren went on. "Winter is here. The snow is only going to get deeper. Maybe Maybe it is time some of us went back, before the passes close for good. A few heads nodded, not because they wanted to leave, because they were afraid. Sienna understood that. She felt the fear herself every night, in the dark, when the doubt crept in and asked her the question she could not answer. What if she had brought all these people here to starve? Before she could speak, another voice rose from the edge of the firelight. It was Cora. The widow stepped forward, pulling her thin shawl tighter, and her face was calm in a way that only people who have already lost everything can be calm. I lost my home, she said quietly. Some seasons ago. There is nothing waiting for me where I came from. No hearth, no name. No one who would so much as look up if I walked back through that gate. She looked around at the gathered faces. Here, someone learned my name on the first day. Here, when my hands shook from the cold, a man I had never met put his own cloak around my shoulders and asked for nothing. Her eyes found Dorian, standing quiet at the back of the chamber, and then moved on. I would rather be hungry in a place that sees me than full in a place that does not. The fire crackled. No one spoke for a long moment, and Sienna felt something shift in the room. Not enough to drive the fear out, but enough to remind them all of why they had come. It was into that fragile quiet that the messenger arrived. He came on a half-dead horse, stumbling up through the snow, half-frozen and gray-faced. He was not a soldier. He was a courier, the kind of man sent to carry words that powerful people did not wish to speak themselves. He was brought to the chamber, given water, set near the fire, and then he delivered his message. I come from the capital, he said, his voice cracked with cold. From the High Advisor, from Mercer. At the back of the chamber, Dorian went very still. His own advisor. Sending messengers north, in the king's name, while the king himself stood in this valley with snow in his hair. The cold understanding that had begun in the archives now settled fully into his chest. Mercer was not waiting for him to return. Mercer was moving without him. Speak it, Sienna said. The courier swallowed. The advisor knows what gathers here, he said. He knows of the old marks, the old throne. He calls it a sickness, a rot that will spread if it is not cut out. He drew a shaking breath. He offers terms. Terms, Sienna repeated. Give yourselves up. Scatter back to your packs. Renounce the old claim and swear it was never real. The courier could not meet her eyes. And in return, the advisor will let these people live. The settlement will be spared. No one will be harmed. He paused. On one condition. The chamber had gone utterly silent. Hand over the woman who carries the mark, the courier said. Hand over the last heir of the old line. Give him the sovereign, and everyone else walks free. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, and then every face in the chamber turned, slowly, toward Sienna. She did not move. She had known, somewhere deep down, that it would come to this, that sooner or later the world above would offer the oldest bargain there is. One life for many. The single body in exchange for the safety of the crowd. It was such a clean bargain. That was what made it so cruel. Dorian crossed the chamber to her side. His voice was low, meant only for her. It is a lie, he said. Mercer does not keep bargains. He will take you, and he will scatter these people the moment your back is turned, and then he will hunt them at his leisure. I know how he works. I have watched him do it for years. Perhaps, Sienna said softly. There is no perhaps. If you walk out of this valley and put yourself in his hands, you will be throwing your life away for a promise he never intends to keep. I know. Then you cannot consider it. She turned to look at him. And if there were even a chance, she said, that handing myself over would keep these people safe, what kind of queen would I be to let them starve and freeze and die for the crime of standing near me? Dorian had no answer for that, because that was the true shape of the thing. Not survival, not strategy. Something far harder. What does one owe the people who chose to stand with you, when standing with you is the very thing that puts them in danger? That was the question that kept Sienna awake long after the others had gone to their rest. She walked the cold halls alone, the way she had walked the empty streets of the village on the night her old life ended. She passed the sleeping forms of the people who had followed her: Maeve, Bram, Cora, Rowan, who slept apart from the others, still carrying the weight of what he had been. Every one of them had come here because they believed in something, and every one of them was now in danger because of her. She climbed at last to the great chamber where the moon wolf waited. Its light had grown so faint that for a moment in the dark she could barely see it at all. You heard, she said. I hear everything that happens beneath this mountain, the moon wolf answered. Its voice was thinner now. It seemed to come from farther away with every passing day. Then tell me what to do. Her voice broke on the words. If I stay, they may all die of hunger before the snow even melts. If I give myself up, perhaps they live. Perhaps. Tell me which is right. You know the old ways. You know the cost of a throne. Tell me. The moon wolf was quiet for a long while. Do you know why the old kingdoms fell? It asked at last. She shook her head. Because their rulers came to believe that they must carry every burden alone, the great creature said. That the weight of every life was theirs to bear, and theirs alone to spend. They mistook loneliness for strength, and in the end, that mistake hollowed them out, until there was nothing left of them but the burden. It lifted its fading head. You are asking me whether to throw yourself away to save them, but you are asking the wrong question, daughter. You are still thinking like a woman who must stand alone before the world. You are still standing in that square. Sienna's breath caught. Then, what is the right question? Ask them, the moon wolf said gently. They are not children. They chose this. They have the right to choose what comes next. A true leader does not decide who lives and dies in their place. A true leader trusts the people enough to face the truth beside them. Sienna stood very still. For her whole life, she had been told what she was worth, what she was allowed to want. She had never once been asked. She had only ever been decided about, and here she had nearly done the same thing to the people who trusted her, nearly decided their fate for them, in the dark, alone, because she thought that was what a leader was supposed to do. There is one thing more, the moon wolf said, and then it did something that stopped her heart. It rose to its full, vast height. The faded light of its body began to gather, to brighten, to burn. The crystals across the ceiling answered, blazing one after another, and a deep rumble rolled through the mountain, the sound of ancient mechanisms waking after 1,000 years of sleep. "What are you doing?" Sienna cried. "What remains," the moon wolf said, "remains to be spent. Far below the chamber, deep in the roots of the mountain, stone doors that had been sealed for centuries ground slowly open. The whole settlement woke to the sound. People stumbled into the halls in alarm, then in wonder, as the crystal light spread before them, lighting passage after passage, opening way after way. Sienna ran with them, down and down, following the glow into the deep places no one had yet dared to explore. And there, at the bottom, they found it. A vault, vast beyond imagining, rows upon rows of preserved grain, sealed in ancient stone against the slow turning of the years, tools wrapped in oiled cloth, seeds protected by a craft so old that no one living remembered it, enough to carry not one winter, but many, enough to feed not these few, but hundreds. The people wept. Some fell to their knees. Some laughed. Some simply stood and stared, unable to take it in. The kingdom had not abandoned them. The kingdom had been waiting all along, holding its breath, keeping its promise across 1,000 silent years. But Sienna did not weep, because she had seen what it cost. When she turned back toward the great chamber, the moon wolf stood dimmer than she had ever seen it. The light no longer filled its body. It flickered now, like a candle guttering low. And when it looked at her, its silver eyes were tired in a way that frightened her to the bone. "You spent yourself," she whispered, "to do this." "I spent what was mine to spend," it said softly, "so that you would not have to spend yourself." Tears stung her eyes. "I never asked you to." "No," the moon wolf agreed. "You did not. That is precisely why it was worth giving." Sienna stood before it for a long time and felt the truth of the whole evening settle into her like a stone into deep water. She had been ready to throw her life away, and the oldest, wisest thing she had ever known had quietly thrown away a piece of itself instead, not so that she could be saved, but so that she could be free to choose. By the next morning, the fear in the settlement had changed its shape. The vault had not made the danger disappear. Mercer's bargain still stood. His knives were still being sharpened in the south, but the people no longer faced the winter with empty hands, and a fed body makes a braver heart. Sienna gathered them all in the great chamber. Hundreds of faces now turned up toward her in the crystal light. She did not pretend to have all the answers. She had learned by now that pretending only made people trust her less. "There is a bargain on the table," she said. Her voice carried clear and steady through the vast room. "My life, for your safety. And I will tell you honestly, last night I nearly took it. I nearly walked out of this valley in the dark and handed myself over, and decided your fate for you, without ever asking what you wanted." A murmur moved through the crowd. "I will not do that," she said. "You are not my burden to spend. You are not children to be protected from the truth. So here is the truth. The man in the south does not keep his bargains. If I give myself up, he will scatter you, and then he will hunt you, one by one, until the old line is nothing but a story again." She let that settle. "I cannot promise you safety," she said. "I cannot promise you comfort, or certainty, or an easy road. The only thing I can promise is that whatever comes for us, it will not find a single one of you facing it on your own." The chamber was silent. And then Cora stepped forward and stood at her side. then Bram, then Maeve, then, slowly, even Soren, his jaw tight, his fear still plain on his face, but his feet carrying him forward all the same. One by one, they came to stand beside her, not because she had commanded them, not because they had no choice, because she had told them the truth and trusted them with it, and that was a thing not one of them had ever been given before. At the back of the chamber, Dorian watched it happen, and felt something turn over in his chest that he could not name. He had ruled by fear for his whole life, and called it order. He was watching now what it looked like to lead by truth, and he understood, with a quiet and total certainty, that he had spent his entire reign on the wrong side of that line. That night, the settlement did not rest. They prepared. They counted the vault and rationed the stores. They studied the old maps of the passes. They set watchers on the high ridges, eyes turned south toward the road that Mercer's people would have to climb, and Sienna stood at the edge of the valley as the snow fell, looking out into the dark, knowing that the longest night was still ahead of them. The bargain had been refused, which meant the answer would come on horseback, and soon. But for the first time since the night, a hand had struck her down before her whole world. She was not afraid of what was coming, because she would not be meeting it alone. By the time the pale sun lifted over the eastern ridge, the whole valley was awake. Word had come down from the high watchers before dawn, carried mouth to mouth through the cold halls, riders on the southern road, many of them, moving fast through the deep snow, dark banners snapping against a gray and brittle sky. This was no lone courier on a dying horse. This was a column, armed, ordered, climbing toward them with purpose. The people gathered along the old stone terraces that looked down over the pass. Craftsmen set aside their tools. Mothers drew their children close against their skirts. The smell of cook fires and cold iron drifted through the morning air, and beneath it ran something sharper, the faint, sour scent of fear, rising off the crowd like mist off a winter river. No one knew whether the day would end in peace or in blood. Everyone understood the same thing. Something was about to break open, just as it had on the night this whole story began. Sienna stood near the ancient gateway, where the snow lay heavy and untouched on the pines. The morning carried a strange stillness, the kind of silence that settles over the world just before a great storm decides which way to turn. Her breath clouded in front of her. Her heart beat slow and steady, though she could not have said why. Beside her, the moon wolf watched the horizon. Its light was almost gone now. She could see the gray rock of the mountain straight through its faded body, the way one sees the world through a veil of moving mist. It had spent so much of itself to wake the vault, to feed her people, to hold them through the early dark of winter. What remained was thin and flickering, a candle guttering in the last of its wax. "You should rest," she said softly. "You have given more than enough. Whatever is coming up that road, let me meet it. You do not have to be here for this." "Not yet," the moon wolf answered. Its voice was barely a breath now, a thing she felt more than heard. "There is one thing more that must be witnessed," it said, "and I would not miss it for all the years I might have left." Sienna looked at it for a long moment, at the ancient weariness in those fading silver eyes, and she did not argue again. She only reached out and rested her hand against its great translucent shoulder, and felt the faint warmth there, like the last heat of a hearth long after the fire has died. Then she turned back toward the pass and waited. The riders reached the valley as the morning light hardened. They came up through the snow in a long, dark line, and at their head rode a figure Sienna recognized at once, though she had never once stood face to face with him. She knew him by the cold that traveled ahead of him. Mercer. He was older than she had pictured, soft of face, soft of step, even in the saddle, with pale and patient eyes that moved across the settlement and seemed to weigh each thing they touched. He took in the homes built into the living stone, the gardens, sleeping beneath their winter coverings, the hundreds of people gathered along the terraces. His expression did not change at all. He looked at a thriving kingdom the way a careful man looks at a weed grown up through the cracks of his clean stone floor. Something to be pulled out by the root before it spreads. He drew his horse to a halt a stone's throw from the gateway. His armed wolves fanned out behind him in a dark crescent across the white field, the breath of their mounts rising in the cold. And then his gaze found Sienna, and a thin, patient smile touched the corners of his mouth. "So," he said, "here stands the rot at the heart of my warning." His voice carried easily across the frozen air. It was a voice built for assemblies, a voice that had spent a long lifetime shaping what crowds chose to believe, smoothing hard things into reasonable things, making cruelty sound like wisdom. "Look at her," Mercer said. He turned in his saddle, spreading his arms wide, addressing the gathered people as though they were already his. "Look at the creature you have followed into the snow. Look at the throne you have starved your children for." His tone was almost gentle, almost sorrowful. "A cast-out Omega, a woman judged and dismissed before her own pack, who fled into the wilderness, wrapped herself in old stories, and called it a crown. This is what you bled for. This is the legend that warmed you through the long nights." He let the words settle into the silence. It was, Sienna realized with a cold and perfect clarity, the very same thing they had done to her in the square. The same trick. The same slow poison. Set the lone woman in the center of the circle, name her worthless loudly enough, and let the crowd's oldest fears do the rest of the work. "There were no sovereigns," Mercer went on, his voice rolling out smooth as oil over still water. "There was no older throne. These are fables, bedtime tales whispered to frightened children, and legends." His pale eyes came to rest on Sienna, and the smile sharpened. "Legends do not create rulers," he said. "Luck does not create legitimacy. A strange mark upon the skin does not make a queen. She is what she has always been. Nothing. You have followed nothing into the cold, and you will die for nothing, unless you find your sense and walk away from her before it is too late." The words rang out across the valley and died slowly in the snow. And for one terrible moment, Sienna felt the old fear rise, the fear that he was right. It was a fear she knew intimately. It had lived in her for 24 years, whispering through every cold morning and every lonely night, telling her that she was a mistake, a flaw, a thing the world had only ever tolerated and would be better without. She felt it climb her spine, and then she felt the small, work-roughened hand of the widow Cora slip quietly into hers on one side, and the solid, unmoving warmth of Bram on the other. And behind her, pressing close in the cold, the 100 and more people who had chosen, in the dark and the hunger and the doubt, to stand exactly where they were standing. The fear did not leave her, but it no longer ruled her. That, she understood now, was the difference. Courage had never meant the absence of fear. It meant feeling all of it, every cold whisper, and choosing to stand anyway. Sienna lifted her chin. "You are very good with words," she said. Her voice did not shake. It carried, clear and even, across the frozen field. "You stood me in a circle once before. You and men exactly like you. And you used words just like these. You taught a whole pack to look at me and see something worthless. And I will tell you the truth, Mercer. It almost worked." She took one step forward, away from the gateway, out into the open snow. "But you have made one mistake," she said. "You believe the people behind me followed a legend. They did not. They followed a hand that reached for them when they were freezing. A voice that learned their names when no one else had ever bothered. A promise that no one here would ever again be measured by the rank of their birth." Her silver eyes held his without wavering. "You cannot lie that away. You cannot smooth it over. Because they have lived it every single day with their own hands and their own hunger. And a thing you have lived is not so easily talked out of you." For a heartbeat, Mercer's patient smile thinned. Then he recovered it. "Brave speech," he said lightly, "from a woman with no army at her back and no proof in her hands." "Proof," Sienna repeated very softly. And in that exact moment, the world changed. It began as a tremor underfoot. A deep shiver in the bones of the mountain felt through the soles of every boot in the valley. The horses shifted and stamped. Somewhere in the crowd, a child went silent. Then the wind died completely. The falling snow seemed to stop. Each flake hung suspended in the still air for one impossible breath, glittering, motionless, as though the morning itself had drawn in its breath and forgotten to let it out. And then the light came. All across the valley, hidden in the ridges and buried beneath centuries of snow, ancient crystal towers that no living wolf had ever laid eyes upon began to blaze. One after another, silver fire raced along forgotten pathways carved into the mountainsides, leaping from peak to peak, lighting the old symbols, lighting the whole frozen valley from end to end, as though the moon itself had descended in the full light of morning to walk among them. The armed wolves behind Mercer cried out and threw their arms across their eyes, and at the heart of it all, the moon wolf rose. For weeks it had faded, thin and flickering, barely able to hold its own shape together. Now the light came surging back into it from every corner of the waking kingdom, streaming through the air in great rivers of silver, pouring into the ancient creature until its faded form blazed brighter and stronger and more vast than anyone in that valley had ever dreamed a thing could be. It threw back its enormous head, and it howled. The same howl that had rolled down out of these mountains on the night Sienna was struck before her pack. The same soul-deep, ancient sound that had once frozen a whole assembly in the middle of a breath, but closer now, vaster. A sound that was not so much heard as felt, in the chest, in the marrow, in the deepest and most forgotten part of every wolf standing in that snow. The sound of 1,000 years, waking all at once. Conversation died everywhere it touched. The armed line behind Mercer wavered. And then, one by one, the wolves began to move. Not forward as they had been ordered, not with weapons raised. Down. They lowered their heads. They could not help it. Every instinct they carried, every drop of blood that ran in their bodies, recognized exactly what stood before them. Not a story, not a fable. The true and ancient authority that their own kings had spent generations laboring to erase from the world. They bowed, not because anyone commanded it, because something older than command, older than fear, older than the orders they had ridden here to obey, remembered. And across the whole valley, it spread like a tide. The people of the settlement bowed. The riders from the south bowed. Hardened soldiers who had climbed that pass to scatter a rebellion sank slowly to their knees in the deep snow, tears standing in their eyes, helpless and unashamed before a truth far older than anything they had ever been taught to serve. Only two figures in all that valley remained standing: Mercer, and among the kneeling crowd, slowly straightening to his full height, Dorian Cade. Mercer turned in his saddle, and for the first time, the smooth mask cracked. "Get up," he hissed at his wolves. "Get up, all of you. This is a trick of the light. Mountain sorcery, nothing more. A cheap conjuring meant to weaken your spines. Get up and do your duty." No one moved. "You see what she is now?" Mercer said, and his voice climbed, losing its careful and patient edge, fraying at the seams. "You see the danger of her. This is exactly what we were warned of generations ago. This is the very reason the old line had to be buried in the first place." The words tore out of him before he could stop them, and in the vast silence of that bowed and shining valley, they rang out far, far louder than he had ever meant them to. Sienna went very still. "Buried," she said. The word hung in the cold. Mercer's pale eyes flickered, and something behind them began, at last, to come apart. "You said buried," Sienna repeated, slow and deliberate, taking another step toward him through the snow. "Now why? Why would a man bury a thing that never existed? Why would anyone hunt a fable? Why would your kind spend whole generations scratching names out of books, sealing them away, killing the memory of them? If those names were only bedtime stories told to frightened children?" The understanding moved through the kneeling crowd like a cold wind passing over water. "You knew," Sienna breathed. "All of it. You knew the sovereigns were real. You knew what this mark on my shoulder meant the moment you heard it had surfaced again. Your kind did not forget the old line, Mercer." Her voice rose now, clear and ringing. "You hid it on purpose, across hundreds of years, because a world that measures a wolf by the truth of their heart is a world where men like you can never rule by fear." "Be silent," Mercer snapped. But it was far too late. The truth had a shape now, standing plain in the morning light for everyone to see. The book Dorian had found in the dust, sealed for centuries. The history scrubbed clean from every lesson a pup was ever taught. The patient, smiling man who had appeared at the king's shoulder at the very moment the old marks began to surface, murmuring always of fear, of order, of the urgent need to cut the rot out before it spread. Mercer had never been protecting the pack. He had been protecting a lie. A long, careful, generations deep lie, and the power that had grown out of it. And it was then that Dorian Cade began to walk. Every eye that could lift, lifted to watch him. He moved through the kneeling ranks, past the people of the valley, past the few loyal riders who had come north with him weeks before and now knelt among the rest. He walked through the silver light, his boots breaking the untouched snow, his face set with something Sienna had never seen on it before. Certainty. Not the cold certainty of a king issuing a sentence. The hard-won certainty of a man who has finally decided what kind of man he is going to be. He came to stand at her side as an equal in full view of two kingdoms. A gasp moved through the crowd. My king. Mercer's voice cracked now, and a thread of real panic ran beneath it. Step away from her. Step back to your own people, where you belong. Whatever sorcery this is, it has clouded your judgment, addled your senses. Come back to me, and we will speak of it quietly. And all of this can still be undone. Dorian looked at him for a long, long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, and it carried to the very farthest edge of that frozen valley. I have spent my entire life listening to you, he said, to you and to men exactly like you, men who told me that fear was the same as order, that cruelty was the same as strength, that a king must strike down anyone who dares to stand too straight, or the whole world will surely come apart in his hands. He shook his head slowly, and I believed it. I struck a woman down before my entire pack because you told me it was necessary. And I told myself the very same lie so well, so smoothly, that I almost did not feel the thing it was tearing out of me as I did it. He turned then and looked at Sienna, and the hard mask was wholly gone from his face. I have watched her these many weeks, he said, his voice rougher now. I have watched her feed people who could never repay her. I have watched her speak hard truths aloud when soft lies would have been far kinder and far easier. I have watched her refuse to throw away a single life, even her own, even when throwing herself away would have been the simplest road out of every trouble we faced. His gaze did not leave her. I rode north certain that I would find a threat to my throne, he said. I found instead the only ruler I have ever known who truly deserved one. You are a fool, Mercer spat, and now there was venom in it, and beneath the venom, terror. You will lose everything. Your crown, your name, your pack. Every last thing your bloodline has built across all these generations. Perhaps, Dorian said. And then he said the words that broke the final thread of Mercer's power. But I would rather lose a throne built on a lie than keep one for a single day longer. He turned his back on his advisor. He turned his back on the army, on the South, on the whole careful, ordered, frightened life he had ruled from for so long. And he faced Sienna in the blazing silver light, with a kneeling valley spread out all around them. Mercer stood alone now, utterly alone, exactly as Sienna had once stood alone, in another circle, on another cold night, with not one soul in all the world willing to step to her side. The advisor looked around him, at the bowed heads, at the blazing towers, at the king who had walked away and would not look back. And for the first time in his long and careful life, the smooth mask fell away entirely, and the thing beneath it showed plain. Not anger, fear. The naked fear of a man who had built his whole existence on the certainty that no one would ever look at him too closely, and who had just, in a single morning, been seen completely by everyone all at once. "This is not over," Mercer said, but the voice was thin now, hollow, the voice of a man who already knows, in his bones, that it is. No one moved to stop him as he wrenched his horse around. No one needed to. His own riders did not rise to follow. They stayed where they knelt, in the snow, in the silver light, unwilling to lift a single weapon at the word of a man whose lie had just come apart in front of their eyes. He rode out of the valley alone, and the light of the waking towers followed him all the way to the mouth of the pass, and then let the dark of the trees swallow him whole. Sienna let out a slow, shaking breath. The danger had not truly vanished. She understood that, even now. Mercer would run south, and he would tell his own twisted version of this day, and there would be reckonings yet to come. The world did not remake itself in the space of a single morning, but the circle had turned. She looked out across the trembling valley, at the hundreds of bowed heads, at the people who had chosen her, at the riders who had climbed that pass to scatter her and had instead sunk to their knees in the snow. She looked at the vast, blazing form of the moon wolf, brighter now than it had ever been in all the long centuries of its waiting, and she finally understood what the ancient creature had meant. There is one thing more that must be witnessed. This, and in the silver hush of that turned and trembling valley, with a kneeling kingdom all around her, Sienna Locke felt something she had no name for, not triumph, not even relief, something quieter and far heavier, because the circle had turned, but it had not yet closed. There were words that had still never been said, a debt no one had spoken aloud, and beside her, the great guardian who had held on so long was beginning, at last, to dim. The hardest part of being seen, she would learn, was never the fight to be seen at all. It was what came after. For a long moment after Mercer vanished into the trees, no one in the valley moved. The silver light still poured from the waking towers. The snow still hung soft and bright across the terraces, and the whole gathered crowd, the settlers and the soldiers alike, remained where they knelt, as though afraid that any motion might shatter the thing that had just happened. Sienna stood at the center of it all. She did not feel like the center of anything. She felt like a woman who had walked a very long way through the cold, and had finally, against all reason, arrived. Then Dorian Cade turned to face her, and before the whole valley, before two kingdoms, before the kneeling and the watching and the weeping, the Alpha King lowered himself to one knee in the snow. A gasp moved through the crowd. Sienna's breath caught in her throat. This was not a man surrendering. There was no defeat in it. His shoulders were straight, his head unbowed at first, his eyes lifted to hers. It was something else entirely, something offered freely, that no one had asked of him and no one could have demanded. It was respect. That night, Dorian said, and his voice was rough, and it carried in the stillness. That night in the square, you asked me a question. You stood there alone, with my hand fresh against your face, and you asked me why you were the only one standing there. He paused. The memory of it sat heavy between them. The crowd, the torches, the crack of his palm, the silence where a defender should have been. I have thought about that question every single day since you walked away from me, he said. I have turned it over in the dark when sleep would not come. I have carried it north through the snow, and somewhere along that road, I finally understood the answer. He bowed his head then, slowly, completely, a king lowering his crown before a woman the world had thrown away. You should never have been standing there alone, Dorian said. The words landed in the valley like the first warm rain after a long winter. Sienna felt the tears come before she could stop them. Not the sharp tears of grief she had cried so many times in that small rented cottage. Something softer, something that washed instead of burned. Around the valley, others were weeping too. The old healer, Cora, with her hand pressed to her mouth. Even Bram, the quiet hunter, turned his face away to hide what was on it. I thought I was passing judgment on an Omega, Dorian said, lifting his eyes to her once more. I told myself I was upholding the law, keeping the order, doing the hard and necessary thing that a leader must do. His voice broke, just slightly. I did not realize, he said, that I was standing before a queen. The silence held for one long, trembling breath. And then the valley moved. It was not a roar. It was not a cheer. It was something deeper and quieter than either. All across the snow, those who had bowed lifted their eyes to her now, and held them there, openly, the way no one had ever once let her be looked at. Only recognition. Only the simple, overwhelming acknowledgement of a worth that had always been there, waiting, beneath the cast-off cloak of a woman they had once been taught to overlook. Sienna looked down at the king kneeling in the snow before her, and the strange thing, the thing she would turn over in her own mind for a long time afterward, was that she felt no triumph. She had imagined this moment in some bitter corner of her heart, on the worst of her nights. She had imagined them all bowing. She had imagined him on his knees. She had imagined how good it would feel to look down at the people who had looked down at her. It did not feel the way she had imagined. It felt instead like grief and forgiveness arriving at the same time, hand in hand, and not quite knowing which of them should speak first. "Stand up," she said softly. Dorian blinked. "Stand up, Dorian Cade." Her voice steadied. "I do not want a king on his knees. I have spent my whole life looking up at people who looked down on me. I am not going to build a throne by making them look up at me instead." Slowly, he rose, and when he stood before her again, at his full height, she held his gaze and said the thing she needed him most to hear. "You knelt," she said, "and I will not forget that you knelt. But understand me. If you ever stand beside me, truly beside me, it will not be because you owe me a debt. It will not be because a bond decided it, or because guilt drove you north, or because you needed to make a wrong thing right." She drew a breath. "It will be because you choose me," she said, "with your eyes open, as an equal, knowing exactly what I am and exactly what I am not, the throne and all of it. Otherwise, I would rather stand alone, and I am no longer afraid to stand alone." Dorian was quiet for a moment, and then, in front of all of them, he smiled. A real smile, the first she had ever seen on him, and it changed his whole hard face into something younger and far more human. "I have wanted nothing else," he said, "since the night you refused to lower your eyes." She felt the bond hum between them, warm and steady, and for the first time she did not fight it, because it was not a chain anymore. It was a choice. It was then that the moon wolf stirred. The vast, blazing creature had stood silent through all of it, watching, its light filling the valley. Now it moved, slowly, and turned its great shining head toward Sienna, and she felt her heart clench before it ever spoke, because she knew. She had known somewhere, since the moment the light came surging back into its faded body. A candle does not burn brightest because it has found new wax. It burns brightest at the very end, when it spends all that remains at once. "Daughter," the moon wolf said. Its voice was gentle, tired, full of something that sounded almost like joy. "No," Sienna whispered. She crossed the snow to it, reaching up, pressing both hands to its great glowing shoulder. "No, not now. We have only just begun. There is so much still to do. I need you. They need you. You cannot." "Listen to me," the moon wolf said softly. She fell silent. The tears were running freely down her face now, bright in the silver light. "For 1,000 years, I have waited in the dark beneath this mountain," it said. "Not for a kingdom, not for a throne, for this. For the moment when the last daughter of the old line would stand in the open, seen at last, surrounded by people who chose her of their own free hearts. Its silver eyes shone. I have waited 1,000 years to know that the truth did not die when they tried to bury it. And now I know." "Then stay," Sienna pleaded. "Stay and see what we build. Stay for the rest of it." "I have already seen the only thing that mattered," the moon wolf said. The rest belongs to you. To all of you. It was never meant to belong to me." It lowered its great head until its brow rested, feather light, against hers. "A guardian holds a thing in trust," it said, "until the ones it was meant for are ready to carry it themselves. You are ready now. You have all become ready. And a thing held too long in trust begins, in the end, to keep the living from truly living." "Please," she breathed. "Be at peace, daughter," the moon wolf said. "This is not a sorrow. This is a gift I have wanted to give for longer than you have been alive." And then it lifted its head, and it began to give itself away. The light that filled its body did not fade this time. It scattered. It broke apart into 1,000 drifting points of silver, like dandelion seeds caught on a summer wind, and they rose up into the air above the valley, and they spread. They did not vanish. They settled. One drifting mote of light came to rest on the brow of the old healer, and her tired hands seemed suddenly to remember a strength they had not held in years. Another settled on Bram, and another on Cora, and another on Soren, who had wanted to leave, and another on Rowan, who had come as a spy and stayed as something better. The light touched the kneeling soldiers. It touched the children on the terraces. It touched the homes built into the old stone, and the gardens sleeping beneath the snow, and the towers blazing on the ridges. It touched everyone. The moon wolf was not dying, Sienna understood, with a grief so vast it felt almost like awe. It was dividing. It was giving the thing it had guarded alone for 1,000 years to every single soul in that valley, so that no one would ever again have to carry it by themselves, so that the strength of the old line would not live or die with one woman, one guardian, one throne, but would live instead in all of them, in the simple shared keeping of ordinary hearts. "This is what the sovereigns truly were," the moon wolf said, its great form growing faint now, translucent, beautiful. Not rulers above the people themselves, awake, remember that, build that, and the old kingdom will never fall again, because it will not be a thing one tyrant can ever bury. It will be a thing that lives in everyone. Its eyes found Sienna's one last time. You were never a mistake, it said. You were a promise, kept across 1,000 years, and you have kept it beautifully. And then the last of the light lifted from its fading shape, and rose and joined the rest. And the great stone platform where the moon wolf had rested for 1,000 years stood empty and silent and washed in gentle morning light. Sienna stood with her empty hands still raised. For a moment, the loss was so sharp she could not breathe. And then she felt it, the warmth, not in her chest alone, where it had lived since the night in the square, but all around her, in the air, in the towers, in the people standing in the snow, every one of them now carrying a small, steady point of that ancient silver light somewhere deep inside. The moon wolf was gone, and the moon wolf was everywhere. It had not left her alone. It had simply made certain that she never could be, ever again. Dorian came to stand beside her. He did not speak. He did not try to fill the silence with comfort. He simply stood, close, his shoulder near hers, sharing the weight of it the way the strong share weight with the strong. After a long while, Sienna wiped her face and turned to her people. Hundreds of faces lifted toward her in the silver morning. She had no grand speech prepared. She had never been the kind to have grand speeches ready, but she found when she opened her mouth that the words were simply there, the way the warmth was there, steady and waiting. I was told my whole life that I was nothing, she said. Her voice carried clear across the valley. I was told it so often, and by so many, that I very nearly believed it. I stood in a circle once, struck down, alone, while everyone I had ever known decided that I was worth less than the dirt beneath their feet. She paused and let her gaze move across them. The settlers, the soldiers, the children, the king. And here is what I learned in the long, cold walk between that circle and this one, she said. My worth was never theirs to measure. It never was. It never could be. Worth is not a thing that is handed down to you by the powerful, like a coin tossed to a beggar. It is not granted by a crown, or a rank, or the approval of a crowd. Her voice grew stronger. It is simply true. It was true of me when I was an omega no one would defend. And it is true of every single one of you. The hunter and the healer, the widow and the orphan, the soldier who came here to do harm and chose, instead, to kneel for the truth. Every last one of you carries a worth that no one has the right to weigh. She lifted her chin. So hear me now, she said. Whatever we build here, it will not be a kingdom of high and low. There will be no circle where one of us stands accused while the rest look away. No one here will ever again be told that they matter less because of who they were born to be. That is the throne I will keep, not a throne above you. A throne that belongs to all of us. For a heartbeat, the valley was silent, and then it broke open with a sound that was not fear, and was not grief, but was something Sienna had never once in her life been on the receiving end of. Belonging. The cheer rolled up the terraces and off the ridges and into the bright, cold sky, and the silver light in the towers flared brighter still in answer, and the people who had followed a voice into the wilderness threw their arms around one another and wept and laughed in the snow. Dorian watched it all with a quiet ache in his chest. He had ruled by fear for his entire life and called it order. He had stood at the top of a careful, frightened world, certain that the only thing holding it together was the strength of his own hand. And here, in a valley he had ridden into expecting to find a rebellion, he was watching something he had never once believed was possible. A people who needed no fear to hold them together, a people held instead by being seen. He understood, with a clarity that humbled him, that everything he had thought made a leader strong had in truth only made him alone, and that the woman beside him, the woman he had struck down before his whole pack, had built in a single season of snow the very thing his bloodline had failed to build across centuries: a home where no one was thrown away. When the cheering finally settled, Sienna turned to him. The crowd was still close around them, but for a moment it felt as though the two of them stood in a quiet of their own. "You knelt for me in the snow," she said, "and I sent you to your feet. So now I will ask you plainly, Dorian Cade, the way you should have been asked, the way I should have been asked long ago." Her silver eyes held his. "Not the bond, not the throne, not the debt. You. Do you choose this? Do you choose me? With your eyes open, knowing exactly who I am, a cast-out woman who will never again bow her head, who will argue with you and stand against you when she believes you are wrong, who will never, ever be a quiet thing at your side." Dorian looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached out, slowly, and took her hand in his. Not the way a king takes a thing he has decided to keep. The way one person reaches for another. Uncertain, hopeful, asking rather than claiming. "On the night I struck you," he said quietly, "something in me recoiled, and I buried it, because I did not understand it. I told myself it was nothing. I have spent my whole life telling myself that the things I felt were nothing." His thumb moved gently across her knuckles. "I am done with that," he said. "I choose you, not the queen, not the legend. The woman who refused to fall when falling would have been easier. The woman who fed strangers and told hard truths and would not throw away a single life. The woman who just sent a king to his feet because she will not let anyone, not even the one she loves, stand above another." He drew a breath. "I choose all of it, with my eyes open, as an equal for as long as you will have me, and not one day less." Sienna felt the bond hum between them, bright and warm and clean. And this time she let it sing. She stepped close. He drew her in. And when at last they came together, in the silver light, in the snow, with a whole kingdom of the once forgotten cheering around them, it was nothing like the fevered pull she had fought so hard against in the cold weeks before. It was slow. It was certain. It was two people who had each, in their own way, walked a very long road through the dark, choosing, at last, to walk the rest of it together. The seasons turned, as seasons do. The snow melted from the high valley, and the gardens woke, and the seeds the moon wolf had guarded for 1,000 years went into the dark earth and rose again toward the sun. The old stone halls filled with the sounds of living, with footsteps and laughter, and the small ordinary music of a people building a home. And they came. They came out of the wilderness, and they came down from the south, drawn by something they could not always name. The ones who had been cast out, the ones who had been overlooked, the ones who had spent their lives standing alone in circles of their own, waiting for a defender who never came. They came to the valley where, it was said, no one was ever thrown away. And they found it was true. Sienna ruled, though she never liked the word. She and Dorian both, side by side, neither above the other, two heads wearing a crown that bowed to no one. The packs of the South did not all welcome it. Mercer's poison did not vanish overnight. There were hard days still, and harder choices, and not every road ran smooth. But the kingdom did not fall. It could not fall in the old way, because it was no longer a thing one tyrant could bury. It lived in too many hearts now. The silver light the moon wolf had scattered burned in all of them, quiet and steady, the simple shared keeping of people who had finally been seen. And on clear nights, when the moon hung full and white above the valley, the towers would glow faintly along the ridges, and the wolves would lift their voices toward the sky. Sometimes, in those howls, Sienna was certain she could hear an older voice woven through them, deep, ancient, patient, and at peace. She would stand at the edge of the terrace on those nights, with Dorian's hand warm in hers, and she would look out at the lit windows of a kingdom built not from power, but from every soul who had refused to stop believing in their own worth when the whole world told them not to. And she would remember the girl in the square, the girl who had been struck down, the girl who had stood alone with no one to defend her, certain in that moment that she was worth nothing at all. She would remember her, and she would forgive the world for what it had told that girl, because the world had been wrong. It had always, always been wrong. A mark on the skin does not make a queen. A crowd does not measure a soul. And no hand, no matter how powerful, no matter how certain, can ever truly cast away a worth that was real all along. That was the truth the old kingdom had remembered. That was the truth they would never let the world forget again. And far beneath the quiet valley, the empty platform where a guardian had waited for 1,000 years caught the moonlight and seemed, in the silver hush, almost to be smiling.